Thanks again, everyone, for joining us today. My name is Megan Colburn. I'm Director of Marketing for Heggerty, and I'm excited to introduce you to our topic and our presenters today. Today, we're going to be exploring the #1 reading skill that your students are missing. I am joined by two of my colleagues, Alisa, VanHekken and Marjorie, Bottari, who are going to be guiding us through today's event. Without further ado, I'd love to hand things off to my colleagues, Alisa and Marjorie. Thank you, ladies.
Thank you so much for taking the time today to join Marjorie and me to learn a little bit more about this #1 reading skill that your students may be missing. As Megan said, my name is Alisa. I serve as the Chief Academic Officer for Heggerty Phonemic Awareness, and I've had the pleasure of being a classroom teacher as well as a literacy specialist and a reading specialist, and have worked around product development for a reading curriculum. And I'm also a mom of 3 girls. And as Megan said, we live in the suburbs of Chicago, close to where the Heggerty headquarters are located in Oak Park.
And I am Marjorie Bottari. I have been lucky enough to be a classroom teacher for grades kindergarten all the way through 6th grade. I've served as a reading specialist, literacy coach, as well as a school administrator. And I am also the mom of 2 children. My son and daughter have been able to experience all of that I've learned here with Heggerty, as well as my working with developing the products, Bridge the Gap, and the early pre-K curriculum as well.
Well, today we just want to welcome you and thank you for joining us. Marjorie and I included our contact information here. If you don't get questions answered today, we will hope to answer every question you have, but we've also added our contact information if you ever want to reach out to us afterwards. But we know that today you came here to learn a little bit more about this #1 reading skill your students may be missing. You may have come as an educator, an administrator, a parent, an interventionist. And while the daily tasks and responsibilities for each of these roles may look different, we all have this common thread of knowing or working with students who are either at the beginning stages of reading or perhaps they're a struggling reader. So to begin, let's consider your background knowledge. We do this with our learners all the time, specifically around the findings of the National Reading Panel. The National Reading Panel condensed several decades of research and identified 5 components of effective reading instruction. So let's think about 4 that are listed here, that we have vocabulary, fluency, comprehension, phonics, but we said there's 5. Can you think of which one is missing? And maybe you're saying it out loud to yourself right now, or you want to drop it in the chat. But as we think about these findings and how they've shaped our instruction, we want to think about all 5 of them as we talk about our topic today. Phonemic awareness. Phonemic awareness is a term we're going to define in just a minute, but as we think about each of these components, as educators, our daily reading instruction ideally spends time on all 5 areas that are listed here. We use a variety of instructional materials and activities to provide instruction in classrooms, in tutoring settings, or at home in order to help all of our students become readers. And perhaps this list highlights or shows an area for you where explicit instruction may not be taking place, or it brings to light an area in which you'd want more intentional instructional materials in order to help your students become readers. Phonemic awareness is often the missing piece in our reading instruction. And over the next 40 minutes, Marjorie and I are going to walk through just what phonemic awareness is and share some ideas that you can use as you think about your own opportunities to work with learners. So today we're going to think about this term phonemic awareness, defining some PH words like phonological awareness, phonemic awareness, and phonics. We're going to talk about why this is so important, why it should be part of our instruction for our learners, and then think about some ways we can provide phonemic awareness instruction. It's actually a lot of fun. We hope to be able to share some really great ideas around engaging learners in language play activities. Now, I just want to share a little bit of information with you before we jump into that what. And this is a graphic that I share, and it's from the EAB report, and it's a phenomenal brief about narrowing the 3rd grade reading gap. And it is one of those resources that is a professional resource for educators, but it's not an overwhelming read. And so if you've not had a chance to take a look at that, I highly encourage you to take a look at what this shares, because it's a powerful image of the best practices we can have in reading instruction. But one of the graphics that's shared in this EAB report is this. And it makes the statement that 95% of elementary students, regardless of background, are cognitively capable of learning to read when they receive sufficient direct instruction on the foundational skills of reading. And I share this graphic because I think it gives us hope. Hope as educators and administrators and parents that 95% of children are capable of learning to read when they receive that sufficient direct instruction around foundational skills. When is a key word in this statement, because when we equip and empower our teachers with the knowledge and resources to provide effective foundational skills instruction, we can impact student outcomes in classrooms. This graphic also makes me feel empowered as an educator, that in our roles as an educator, whether you are a teacher or a parent or an interventionist or administrator, we can provide this effective instruction that moves all of our students onto this path of reading. I think this also connects us back to why you signed up for this webinar today, that we know that 95% of our children are capable, but we also know the reality is that not all of our children are readers. We see this across the country with NAEP scores, or perhaps you're thinking about your own personal experiences as a teacher or a parent, that we know for some of our learners, reading is difficult. Or perhaps you're working with students who are at those beginning stages of reading, and you're thinking about all of the things you need to provide instruction around in order to equip our youngest learners to be readers. But what we know is that something is often missing from our instruction. As we see from those 5 components from the National Reading Panel, and think about our own classrooms, reading instruction is an incredibly large part of our daily routines that we set within our classrooms, and we know it's such a crucial skill to develop in all of our learners. During our time together today, we're going to focus on not reading with all 5 components that we see in the National Reading Panel report, but specifically on helping our students build word recognition skills, giving our students the skills so that they can decode or read words in print, specifically around what it means to help students to develop phonemic awareness, how an instruction can happen for all learners within our classrooms. As we jump in today, I know that everyone has been able to hopefully find that chat feature that's available in the toolbar, but I want you to think about this question or this statement: phonemic awareness is. If you had to define phonemic awareness for someone, what would you say? You have 3 options here, A, B, and C. Is it the understanding of letter-sound relationships, the understanding that words are made up of sounds, or the understanding of meaningful parts of words? Now you can take a look, think about what that is. You can make notes for yourself or drop in the chat A, B, or C as you think about what does this mean when we develop phonemic awareness. When we think about this term, if you are one of the participants who chose B, you are absolutely right. Phonemic awareness is the understanding that words are made up of sounds. If you chose A, that's okay. It's the definition of the word phonics. Phonics is also a foundational reading skill. Phonemic awareness and phonics are terms that are often confused. So hopefully today we can provide you with new learning on how phonemic awareness and phonics can really work together. When we think about defining phonemic awareness, it's the understanding that spoken words are made up of individual sounds called phonemes. And when we help our students to develop phonemic awareness, we're often doing this with oral and auditory activities. Phonemic awareness instruction targets isolating phonemes or sounds in words. It might be sounds we hear at the beginning, in the middle, or even at the end of a word. Phonemic awareness instruction targets blending sounds into a spoken word, hearing sounds and then being able to put them together or say them fast to say a whole word. Phonemic awareness instruction targets segmenting a word into sounds, being able to hear a word and separate a word into sounds, and this helps us to be able to write and spell words on our own. And probably the most complex piece of phonemic awareness instruction is around manipulating sounds in words, being able to change or delete or substitute or add sounds to be able to make new words. Phonemic awareness is oral and auditory. It's really part of language play activities where we help our students to hear these individual sounds, sequence sounds and words, and like we said, even be able to manipulate that sequence in order to create new words. In order to read, students must be able to map the sounds they hear to letters in print. An intentional phonemic awareness instruction teaches students about how this connection takes place, how we can use what we know about sounds to be able to read as well as write and spell words on our own.
Now, as Alisa said, when we talk about phonemic awareness, we are talking about those individual sounds that we hear in words, the smallest unit of sound. And that can often be difficult to hear because while phonemic awareness may seem pretty natural, it's actually not very natural. All of our phonemes or sounds are co-articulated. So we want to support students in becoming sensitive to that internal structure of language. Another PH term you probably often hear is phonological awareness. Now, phonological awareness is also oral and auditory, but think of this as your umbrella term. This also includes those larger units of language, words, syllables, onset rhyme. When we hear those larger units of language, it is much easier to work with them. For example, if I said to students, listen to these two small words, cup, cake, blend those together. What's the word? Cupcake. That is pretty simple to blend. A phoneme falls underneath that umbrella term and is a subset of phonological awareness. If I said these sounds, k, p, it is much more challenging to blend those sounds into the word cup. Now, phonological and phonemic awareness are both oral and auditory. We're helping students attend, again, to that internal structure of language. Phonological awareness develops in a continuum. There are 4 levels. Now, as you heard me just say, the larger the unit, the easier to hear and work with. Those compound words, cup, cake, cupcake, are quite simple to blend. But as you heard Alisa say, the phoneme level is what's going to help our students become readers and writers, being able to hear a sound and represent that sound with a letter or grapheme. So as we think about that phonological awareness continuum, we do begin with those larger units, helping our students understand how to hear and play with those parts. Again, being able to blend, segment, or manipulate. But we do want to be intentional about beginning to narrow those units of language so our students can eventually work with those phonemes. So compound words, those would be the largest unit of language our students can hear. And then we can narrow that working with syllables. We can ask our students to blend these 2 syllables together and say the word. Frozen, frozen. We can take a syllable apart, working at that intrasyllable level with onset rhyme or body coda. I can say to students, listen to these parts and blend them together to say the word. Not. And it is finally at that phoneme level where our students are hearing, again, the smallest unit of sound. Not. And again, this is where that transfer to print happens. So as you think about the learners you have in front of you, you may have a wide range of ages, right? Or even your own children or students you may be supporting with tutoring. As we think about our youngest learners, we really want to build that sensitivity, right? And that's what we're doing with those larger units of language. But our goal will always be to get to that phoneme level so these skills can transfer to print with reading and spelling. Now, there is that other PH term that Alisa alluded to earlier. Phonemic awareness and phonics are often confused because, again, these 2 are very closely related. But it is important for us to understand that they are not the same thing. As you heard us say, when we are working with phonemic awareness, that instructional focus is on the sounds or the phonemes we hear in words. I can say to students, the word is cat. What sounds do you hear? K, a, t. We hear 3 sounds. In phonics, that's where our instructional focus is going to switch to the graphemes or letters that represent the sounds we heard. So k, at in phonemic awareness becomes C, A, T in phonics. Now you may have noticed a reciprocal relationship there. In order for our students to match the letter or graphemes that represent the sounds, they needed to be able to hear the sounds. They needed to be able to hear a word and segment it into all of the phonemes. Phonemic awareness and phonics enjoy a reciprocal relationship. But if phonics instruction is going to be effective, our students need to be phonemically proficient. Now, phonemic awareness, again, is oral and auditory. Think of this as a warm-up. We often tell students, we're playing some listening games, right? We are listening for the sounds that we hear in words. We do then want to follow this up with that explicit phonics instruction. We just heard sounds. Here are the letters that can represent the sounds. So again, as you look at that phonics column, you'll see that reciprocal relationship. As we engage in phonics instruction, it is both visual and auditory. In phonemic awareness, we will ask students to isolate, blend, segment, and manipulate the sounds they hear in words. I can say to students, the word is cap. Add ul after k, and the word is clap. That was pretty challenging, right? We work our way to that level. But when we do that through the air and our students become automatic with that, you're going to see that transfer to their reading and their writing. If I could read the word cap, I can add a ul after k, and look, I can read that new word clap. And that will allow me to spell those words as well. So again, phonemic awareness and phonics, they do enjoy a reciprocal relationship. That's why these two are often confused, but not the same thing. The beautiful thing about phonemic awareness is our students can engage in these lessons before they know all of their letters and sounds. I can say to students, the word is man. What's the first sound you hear? I can hear that sound even if I don't yet know it's the letter that represents the sound. Now, as we think about reading, Alisa had shared, those 5 critical components of literacy instruction. We know that reading is not necessarily simple to teach, but it is nice to take a look at this simple view of reading because really it comes down to 2 pieces. Our students need to be able to read or decode the words and understand the words that they're reading to become a proficient reader. Now, when we look at the simple view of reading, you will notice that reading comprehension is a product of decoding and linguistic comprehension. This is important. This means we need both. So if you think about some of your students, you may have some students that read beautifully. They are automatic and fluent decoders of print. Let's give them a 1 for decoding. But when you ask them some questions about what they read, right, they kind of look at you like, what? I just read the words and I read them really fast. Did I have to understand what I was reading? Well, that's a 0. 1 times 0 is still 0. We cannot create a proficient reader with just one of these pieces. Today, we're talking about that decoding piece. You may have some students that have a high level of comprehension. If you read books to them or they listened to a book on tape, they really have some higher thinking. But when they try to decode or read words, 0 times 1 is still 0. So while this simple view of reading looks quite simple, we know it's not that simple, right? As we think about language comprehension and word recognition, there are a lot of pieces that go into creating fluent and automatic decoders of print. We are talking about that today, that word recognition. Now, as you look at this rope, you can see there are 3 strands embedded into word recognition. I always like to say, take a look at those ropes. While they may start out on their own, they eventually become intertwined. That's that reciprocal relationship I was talking about. Today, we're targeting phonological awareness. And the reason for that is when students struggle to decode, this is the strand it most often comes back to. This is the skill that many students are missing when they struggle with word reading. At no point are we saying it's the only piece of instruction you need, but again, this is often the missing piece of our instruction. So as we think about why phonemic awareness is important, you heard me just say this is often the missing piece for our readers. We know that phonemic awareness is not an optional skill, but it's often, while it's the most critical, it's often the least practiced component of effective early instruction. And we know that awareness of sounds that make up spoken words and facility at manipulating those sounds, and as Alisa talked so much about, that link between speech and print, must be mastered for students to be fluent readers and accurate spellers of an alphabetic writing system like ours. And as you've heard me mention before, it is not actually very natural to hear these sounds. Reading and writing present a cognitive hurdle that listening and speaking do not. Again, there's nothing in the child's normal experience with spoken language that acquaints them with the fact that these words have an internal structure. But it's exactly that they need if that alphabet we're showing them is going to make any sense. So again, these are, like I always like to say, not optional. This is critical for all of our students to have access to these skills. And while we know what the research says, we also know it when we look at our Common Core state standards, right? So whether your state follows Common Core or not, you may have different standards, but I promise you, you're going to see very similar standards, whether you're in the US or in another country, because again, this is the way our brains learn to read. So as we look at our kindergarten standards for Common Core, you'll see the ability to recognize and produce rhyming words, as well as those critical skills of blending and segmenting. When you think back to the 4 levels of phonological awareness I had shared earlier, you will see we start with those larger units like syllables, or at that intrasyllable level, being able to work with onset rhyme, as well as the ability to manipulate and isolate phonemes and words. And as we look at our first grade standards, you're going to see very similar pieces of blending and segmenting. Again, now we're looking at the phoneme level because this is where the transfer to print happens. So we know what the research says, and we also see what our standards say.
Now let's get into some of the fun pieces of phonemic awareness instruction, because it really can be an engaging part of your instruction because it really is oral and auditory language play. So this afternoon, Marjorie and I want to walk through just some different ideas of what it means to teach phonemic awareness, to practice phonemic awareness with the learners with whom you work. So let's start with this skill of rhyme. We just saw the standards where in kindergarten, there's an expectations that our students can recognize and produce rhyming words. If we look at early learning and development standards for our preschoolers, rhyme is often an aspect of those expectations as well. Now, rhyme is something I think as adults, we often think of as an easy skill or even an early skill. And while it is something that students seem to acquire almost naturally, it's something that we often want to define more clearly for our students. Because when words rhyme, we hear the same middle and final sounds. And this is important because sometimes students think words that rhyme sound the same, which is true, or words that rhyme sound the same at the end. That is true as well, but it's those middle and final sounds that we want to draw our students' attention to as to how we can really hear if words rhyme. We also know that not all rhyming activities are equal in level of difficulty. Repeating or hearing rhyming words is a fun way to introduce our youngest learners to what it means to rhyme, even moving into something like rhyme recognition. But as soon as we think about that last rhyme production, generating a word that rhymes, that's actually a complex skill. It requires students to be able to produce a rhyming word. Let's start with rhyme repetition. We can play language games with students, whether it's our own children or the learners with whom we're working, and say, listen to these 2 rhyming words, dot, got. And we can take it even a step further. Can you say dot, got? Can you feel how your mouth feels the same at the end? It sounds the same in the middle, it's middle and final sounds. But we can even say dot and got rhyme because we hear ot in both words. That's what it means when dot and got rhyme. Or listen to these rhyming words. Net, wet. Can you say those words? Let's think of another word, net, wet, set. We can add on more words, providing those rhyming words for our learners, drawing their attention to they all have the rhyming part, at. We know that there are many children's books that highlight these rhyming words for our learners, something like Rhyming Dust Bunnies, which you see in the corner, or Dr. Seuss books, or books like Rhyme Crime and so many others that create these opportunities to say, did you hear that? Did you hear how that author used rhyming words? Let's think about the middle and final sounds that are the same. When we move beyond hearing and repeating rhyming words and start to work with recognizing words that rhyme, this means we're now distinguishing rhyming from non-rhyming words, which is a little bit trickier. To be able to say, do these words rhyme? Wake, sun. Let's listen. Ache, un. Ache and un, those aren't the same middle and final sounds, so no, wake and sun cannot be rhyming words. Really helping our students understand that we're listening for specific sounds when we identify rhyming words as well as non-rhyming words. Then when we get into that production or that generating rhyming words activity, this is a lot harder. Tell me a word that rhymes with hat. Students actually have to change a first sound in a word to make a word that rhymes with hat. In order to say a word like cat or sat, we need to change the at the beginning to in order to produce a word like sat. For some of our learners, it's a little bit challenging to get to this more difficult level, but it's something that we can definitely build up to, working with things like hearing and recognizing rhyming words first, then asking them to start to produce rhyming words. And sometimes teachers ask, what if it's a nonsense word? What if they came up with a word like zat? If it has the same middle and final sounds as hat, for me, it's an acceptable response. Yes, well, that's a silly word we've never heard before, but that and hat rhyme because we hear at in both words. Our rhyme activities can go beyond just saying word pairs that rhyme or don't rhyme and really extending with that word because to help students identify the rhyming part or the middle or final sounds. Now, when Marjorie talked a little bit about phonemic awareness, and especially when we saw the standards for our grade level for kindergarten and first grade, there's an expectation that students are able to isolate sounds at the beginning, middle, and end of a word. When we think of phoneme isolation, we are isolating a sound. We can isolate a sound at the beginning, middle, or end of a word, and this can take place even before we have that letter sound correspondence. I know some of you are working with some students at their very beginning stages of reading with maybe limited alphabet knowledge. Some of us are working with older learners who have those letter names and sounds under their belts, but we know that we can work with this with any type of learner because we're listening for the sound we hear. We can begin with the first or initial sound we hear in a word. We can use any word for this, a single syllable word, a multisyllabic word, and often with our youngest learners, this is where we bring in student names, where we say, your name is a special word. What's the first sound in your name? My youngest daughter's name is Nora. Nora begins with N. We might say, does anyone else in our class have the same first sound as Nora? Nick. Nick and Nora both begin with N. Or can we come up with any word that begins with N? Words like noodles, nice, or neat in order to be able to listen for that first sound. Now, in phonemic awareness, we're hearing these sounds, but in writing, when students go to label pictures and begin to write sentences, they are often matching that first sound to the grapheme or letter that matches that sound. So now we start to encourage them to label pictures with, what's that first sound you hear? Well, we see a picture of the dog. We could isolate the D sound in dog. What letter makes that sound? Let's write that letter. This is how we can begin to write and spell words. When we think about final phoneme isolation, this is the last sound we hear in a word. This tends to be a little bit harder to isolate because often when we speak, we tend to drop final sounds. And so really emphasizing or isolating that last sound is something we might need to enunciate for our learners. To say, my word is drive. Drive. We might extend that sound or say it a little bit louder and say, did you hear the sound at the end of that word? Is the sound we hear. When we want to start writing a word like drive, students might be able to add that final sound or the V, the letter V that matches that sound we hear. We could even say to them, listen to a word like mess. What's the final sound? What other words end with s? And we might think of, a word like bus. Bus and mess both have the same sound at the end. Often the most difficult sounds to isolate are the sounds inside of words. When we think about our CVC or single syllable words, we often think of our medial phoneme as the vowel sound that we hear. When we start to think about older learners and when they write and spell words and perhaps spell some words incorrectly, it's often those sounds in the middle that we struggle to hear or to be able to match letters to. But when we start to think about those vowels, when we're introducing letters and sounds to our students, we often introduce them to consonants and vowels, these special letters. These vowels are letters that every word requires one. And so when we think about this medial sound, we're just listening for that sound, that vowel sound we hear. In a word like keep, E is the sound we hear in the middle. When Marjorie talked about the difference between phonemic awareness and phonics, this is where we're focusing on the sound of E. We're not expecting all of our learners to know EE or EA or silent E. Just listening for that sound is our first step. When we start to match it into print with phonics instruction, perhaps if you're at that level of phonics instruction, you might be talking about that EE vowel team. But we can isolate the vowel sound in a word like keep with the students as young as preschool, because it's really about hearing that sound in the middle of a word. As we work with phoneme isolation, we want to just give you a really quick minute to try this with us. So I know no one's microphones are on, but we're going to pretend that they are. And you're going to say out loud the first sound you hear in the word flash. Hopefully everyone said that is the first sound in the word flash. FL is a consonant blend. Those letters maintain their own sounds. The very first phoneme is F. What is the last sound in place? Hopefully everyone said S. It's the sound that we hear. What is the middle or the vowel sound we hear in a word like cut? Ah is that short vowel sound that we hear in the middle. As we work with these activities, we're asking our students to listen for that sound. Now we can also bring in visual representations to match the first, middle, or final sound in a word. Many teachers are familiar with Alconen boxes, or even just using chips or counters to match sounds. We can have our first sound be one color, our vowel be another color, our final sound be another, and say, listen to my word got. First sound, G, and touch that circle. Ah is the vowel sound, T is the final sound. We can start to make this connection from phonemes to graphemes, sounds to letters, by then saying, let's match a letter to each of those sounds. And with our first kindergarten and first graders, we can start to build words just by thinking about the sounds and being able to make that connection from sounds into print.
And as we think about that skill, blending, this is what we would identify as a basic skill. Now, blending is parts to whole, meaning we give students the parts and they blend those parts together to say the whole word. This is the skill that directly transfers to decoding or sounding out words when we work with print. Now, if we think back to the levels of phonological awareness, again, we would start with those larger units, helping our students understand this concept of being able to hear parts and bring those parts together to be able to say the whole word. So we can say to students, listen to these two syllables, napkin. What's the word? Napkin. Now, 2 syllables is much easier to blend than 3 syllables. So again, as we think about introducing this skill to students, we start with 2, we work our way to 3. Again, this is going to require some more phonological memory, being able to keep the sequence of these syllables. You can bring in finger tapping or chopping using that multisensory approach by your students engaging in hand motions, or bringing in a more concrete visual like Alconen boxes or felt. But the important thing to remember here is this is all oral and auditory, right? We're giving our students the opportunity to hear these parts and then be able to put them together without yet seeing the print. We can hear 44 sounds in the English language. There's over 200 ways to spell those sounds. As we bring in print, it becomes much more complex. Now, while we blend syllables again, we can make that unit smaller by breaking apart a syllable. So we take one syllable and break it apart. And we can do this 2 different ways. Body coda may not be as familiar to you as onset rhyme, but it is a way that allows our students to blend a little bit easier than onset rhyme. We give students the body of the word, meaning all of the sounds through the vowel, and then those ending sounds after the vowel. This allows for continuous blending. I can say to students, map. What was the word? Map. Onset rhyme is just the opposite. Now we are still taking apart a syllable, but this time it's the sounds before the vowel as the onset, and that R-I-M-E rhyme is the vowel and everything after. We can say to students, app. What's the word? Map. Now, again, the intention here is to allow our students to get comfortable with blending parts together to create a whole word. So when we do give them those individual phonemes, they are able to remember parts. They're able to sequence parts and put those parts together to say a whole word. As we think about those individual phonemes, we also want to think about that phonological memory, giving our students the scaffold to first blend 2 sounds, e, me, and then 3 sounds, n, a, t, not, and eventually get into those 4 and more phonemes. Again, here you can bring in more of a multisensory approach, having students finger tap, chop those sounds, and blend those together. I do at some point always like to bring in those Alconin boxes because, as Alisa just showed, we can first blend through the air and then we can match the print that represent those sounds, really helping students see that connection between this oral and auditory warm-up and how that helps us as readers and writers. Something to note as you do get to those 4 and more sounds, it may be tricky for some of your students. We might give them 4 sounds and they might leave out a sound, or they might get those sounds out of sequence. So something that you can do to support them is really bringing or connecting those sounds, right? So we often call that continuous blending. So my guess is here for the your turn that you are able to blend these 3 and 4 sounds together. But as you attempt to do that, think about your experience. Think about the students that you're working with. What are some things that you may have seen before, or some things that you can think of that might be challenging as your students hear these sounds and try to blend them together? Go ahead and share that in the chat if you're looking at some of these sounds, whether it's the 3 or 4 sounds, saying, oh, sometimes my students do this. Blends and digraphs, absolutely. Yes, saying brr as a blend. Sounding out each letter when there are vowel teams. Yes, absolutely. They say red. So yes, if we were to show this to them in print, they would say red because they don't know yet that phonics connection of EA saying E. But if I just said d, what are some things they might say? Maybe they're visually thinking of the word, and maybe they are saying something like read. We might ask them to blend b, r, oak, and they might just say boke, right? They might leave a phoneme out. Maybe they say roke, and they forget that first phoneme. So yes, working memory, leaving off the last sound, r, d, re, or ed, and they forget the first sound. So as we start to think about working with our students, this is why it is important to give them the opportunity for that oral and auditory warm-up. Many of us talked about the confusion that print would bring in for our students. They would confuse the vowel team, or they might think this word is read instead of read. When we give them the opportunity to first hear the sounds, we can teach things like continuous blending. We can give them an opportunity to build that working and phonological memory, because holding on to the sounds is sometimes difficult. Absolutely, Victoria. So what we can do is say, brr, oak. We are connecting all of those sounds for the students. As we give them this practice continuously, it's important that they get this daily opportunity. This is going to allow them to become more automatic with blending parts together, so we can attach this to print. We blended the sounds e, me through the air. Now let's practice this as I show you the letters that make those sounds. Touch each letter and say the sound. E, me. So here on this slide, you can see that reciprocal relationship between blending and decoding, sounding out words. Yes, Shannon, it is multi-layered, right? When print is introduced, that it is so much, Alisa and I always say, it's so much more complex as we bring in print. So again, there is an importance to building this automaticity, freeing up our students, cognitive load by allowing them to first blend and segment and manipulate through the air, and then specifically and targeting with explicit phonics instruction. Now, segmenting is just the opposite of blending. So here we are giving students the whole word and we are breaking it into parts. This skill directly correlates to encoding or spelling, again, when we get to that phoneme level. So here you can see the opportunity first with those larger units. The word is candy. How many chop the word into the syllables you hear? Candy. How many syllables were in that word? Now we can use this as an opportunity to tell students, syllables are a part of a word with a vowel sound, right? Every word needs a vowel. Some words have more than one syllable. That means they have more than one vowel sound. Now, as we segment a word at the intrasyllable level, we do that work with onset rhyme, that first sound and the vowel and everything after. And it's as we get to work with that phoneme level that we are able to transfer this to print. The word is bus. What sounds do you hear? B, s. There were 3 sounds in that word. Often, I like to have students draw a line for each sound, and then they're able to match the grapheme or letter that represents the sound we hear. So you can see that right here on this slide with that phoneme grapheme connection. Again, these skills do enjoy a reciprocal relationship, and we want students to be able to see that reciprocal relationship. As we think about students that are starting to learn or have already mastered those letter sound relationships, we want to look at their spelling. Segmenting, as you heard me say, directly transfers to encoding or spelling. And this is the best evidence of a child's phonemic awareness. So say the word and segment it. Count the sounds you hear. Now let's match the grapheme or letters that represent those sounds. So as you think about some of your students, and the spelling that you may see in their writing, this is going to give you a phenomenal insight into the support they may still need with phonemic awareness as well as their phonics instruction. So as you look at that first word, chip, if a student were to spell that word SHP, there are quite a few things we know about this student from both a phonemic awareness need and a phonics need. Right away, I see the student cannot segment a word into the 3 sounds. Yes, missing the medial phoneme, exactly. So we're talking about segmenting here, and we're talking about that medial sound isolation. As we think about that with phonemic awareness, I know that student needs that support. And then when I think about it from a phonics lens, I know I still need to work on digraphs. The student understands 2 letters can represent 1 sound. They're not yet able to accurately represent the correct sound with print. But I also want to make sure the student understands that all words have a vowel. As we think about that word must, go ahead and share in the chat, what is this student missing as we think about that phonemic awareness need? Blends, exactly. So we're missing, that 3rd phoneme. So again, you'll often see this as you look at your students' writing. There is so much information here. Exactly, Leah. Their errors are not random, exactly. And so we want to look at their writing. This is going to inform us. And as we look at that word flight, I would say that student can hear all of the sounds in the word. This is really a student that needs some phonics instruction. Flight. You are hearing all of the sounds. Now, I is the sound we hear. And there are quite a few ways we can spell that sound. So that's where phonics instruction comes in.
Now we've walked through a few phonemic awareness activities like rhyme and phoneme isolation and blending and segmenting. And all of those kind of come together and they can come into being able to manipulate or change parts of words or sounds to make new words. And this is something we can do as we add, as we delete, and as we substitute. So when we think about adding, we can add a syllable to be able to make a new word. We can say help, add full, and the word is, and we can make a word like helpful. Or we can even add an initial phoneme to say, listen to my word part like ish. If we add at the beginning, my new word is fish. Now, this comes in when we want to produce rhyming words. If I were to give students a word part like ish and say, who can tell me words that rhyme with ish? They need to add a phoneme or a sound to the beginning of ish, like fish or dish or wish, in order to be able to produce those words. Often with our learners, we think about adding at the beginning, but we can also add at the end. We can say a word like stay, add t at the end, and the word is state. All of this can happen through the air, and bringing in some visuals for our students to show how we can add something in, like you see with things like those squares. Those can be 3x3 Post-its, or cutting felt into squares that are 3x3 can be used to be able to add or change parts to make a new word. As we help our students to be able to, what we can also delete or take away a syllable or sound to make a new word. When we delete, it's just like we know when we are changing something. So we might say my word is kindness. Without ness, what's left is kind. We've talked about this working memory, students being able to hold on to the whole word and then be able to take something away and produce something new. Bringing in those visuals to say, I'm going to pull a whole square away when I delete that syllable ness. What's left is kind can be a visual anchor for students who struggle with that phonological memory. When we delete sounds, we can say what's left or perhaps make a new word. Teach without t. What's left is each. Or we can take away a sound from the end of a word. Hike without k. What's left is high. We're able to teach our students to not just add, but delete or take away, as we then move into being able to substitute or change a part of a word to make a new word. Often when we think about this at the syllable level, we can change that syllable, like winter, change win to sen, and the word is center. Now, for those learners who struggle to hold on to those sounds, ter might be something that they forget was left behind. We can always scaffold to support to say, listen, winter. If I change win to sen, listen, center, center. We have that same syllable at the end. I change the first syllable to make a new word. When we substitute at the phoneme level, we're changing sounds to make new words. And this is something that we can start with that first sound. This sounds a lot like blending, like rhyme production. Say sun, change s to f, and the word is fun. Sun and fun, those are rhyming words. When students struggle to produce rhyming words, it can sometimes be helpful to break it down for them, to be able to say, we're going to change the first sound. Say fun, change f to b, and the word is bun. It's again all about the sounds that we hear. We're not expecting our students to be able to read or write all of these words that we're adding, deleting, or substituting syllables and sounds within, but rather being able to work with this, with the sounds we hear through the air, is a way to build that understanding of how our language can work. This one is always tricky, especially when we see it in print, is to change that final sound in the word nerve. We can isolate that sound at the end, final phoneme isolation, change to s, and the word is nurse. We don't need to know how to spell the word nurse or see it in print, but we can change that final sound to be able to read or to be able to say a new word. When we change that vowel sound, we can substitute one sound and make a whole new word. Read, change E to O, and the word is road. My first and final sounds stay the same. My medial or vowel sound is what we changed. As students start to encounter words in print, whether it's through their own writing or reading, we want them to pay attention to the letters and the sounds that they make, because that helps us to be both a reader as well as a writer. Let's think about this in our own work as you think about some of these examples. Being able to ask students, if we delete or we add or we substitute, how can we make new words? And these are ways that we can bring this in as a fun way to practice. Did you know that we could take a sound away, or we could add a sound or change a sound in order to be able to say a new word. This also can transfer into our own reading. That when we have some of our learners who have adopted strategies of guessing at words, looking at the first letter or two, and then making a quick guess and going on with their reading, we can encourage them to read all the way through. Take a look at that word maze. What's the last sound? We see the letter Z. What sound does that make? Z. So this, I'd have to read all the way through the word in order to be able to decode. Bring this into our students' writing to be able to say, let's pay attention to the letters we know that can match those sounds. So as we start to bring these language play games into instruction or into opportunities for tutoring or even whole class instruction, it's really a way for students to hear the sounds in language and not just isolate that sound, but getting into some more complex things like being able to manipulate sounds at the beginning, end, or within a word in order to be able to make new words. Just like we saw with phoneme isolation, we can make this connection into print to be able to start to think about how can I match letters or graphemes to the sounds that I make. This comes after students have that letter sound correspondence, showing how this reciprocal relationship into phonics can really be this connection for our learners. We have our word dot. If we change the d to an n, we now can change it into the word not. Or if we change our vowel sound, ah to eh, we can now read a word like net. We can start to make connections from all we heard through the air to letters or graphemes, within print.
So as you think about the takeaways for today, one of the things to note is that our phonemic awareness instruction should focus on more than one skill, right? That is going to allow our students that repetition, the practice that they need to become automatic. We talked a whole lot about the importance of being able to do this work through the air so it can connect to print. So giving our students the opportunity to engage in these skills daily. Our lessons should be explicit. It should be intentional. We shared a lot of explicit language today as we think about isolating phonemes or even how we would explain rhyme, having the same middle and ending sounds. While we can absolutely include this in transitions, we don't want that to be the instruction time that we set aside for phonemic awareness. Again, you saw the importance of this. This is a critical skill. It should have about 10 minutes dedicated for that explicit and systematic instruction. So following that systematic progression and allowing our students to build that proficiency with isolating, blending, segmenting, and manipulating. And again, as we engage in these skills, they are oral and auditory. So one final thought before we end our time today, research has shown that explicit phonemic awareness instruction increases the reading and spelling achievement among preschoolers, primary grade children, and students with learning disabilities. So engaging in just about 10 minutes of phonemic awareness instruction in your day, it is just a few minutes, but it is so